Welcome to the layer-by-layer overview for Psalm 22. A way to remember this psalm is with the phrase, "Have you forsaken me?" The king pleads with God as if he has forsaken him. But by the end of the psalm, he has a very different perspective. The psalm is divided into three sections. First, confusion, as the psalmist wrestles with feeling like the Lord abandoned him. The Lord helped his ancestors and even him in the past, so he doesn't understand why the Lord isn't helping him now. The second is crisis, as he relives the physical suffering along with the mockery of onlookers. In the middle of one last cry, one of the most abrupt transitions in the Psalms suddenly shifts into celebration, the last section, as the psalmist proclaims that the Lord does not abandon his afflicted, but always answers them when they call. The psalmist's response is to call all nations to celebrate this God who saves. Each of these sections has a predominant emotional tone. The section on confusion conveys a tone that is confused and frustrated, since the Lord does not seem to be behaving according to the character the psalmist knows. The section on crisis expresses a helpless and alarmed tone, as the psalmist gradually loses what hope he had. The final section, celebration, radiates a tone that is confident and zealous, as the psalmist has a radically different perspective and suddenly sees a purpose in all that went before. For the director, according to the doe of the dawn, a psalm by David. Like many psalms, this psalm was written for the temple music director, which indicates it was intended for official temple usage. The doe of the dawn may refer to an instrument, or, more likely, the melody used when performing this song. The psalm is explicitly said to be by David, which means it should be read as a psalm of God's anointed, a king over Israel. The king had a covenant relationship with the Lord, which meant the king expected the Lord to listen when he called out. This first section begins in verse 2, introducing the confusion of someone whose suffering does not fit the expectations of a covenant relationship with God. Verse 2, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you far from my protection, from my words of groaning?" The poem opens with an anguished cry, which clearly is not his first cry to the Lord because of this situation. This is David at the end of his crying out. He is used to expecting and enjoying God's presence, but it is different this time. He cries out as if asking for the reason, but he is really asking for God to finally respond to his groaning. The opening, my God, conveys the deep emotion of this appeal, as when David calls out upon his son Absalom's death, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom." Every indication is present that David's suffering has gone beyond what he can bear. Verse 3, my God, I cry out by day, but you don't answer, and by night, and I am not silent. David knows his part of the covenant. When he finds himself in trouble, he calls out to the Lord, and he expects the Lord to answer. So many psalms delight in the cycle of calling out and receiving an answer. But calling out here was not effective, though he has been at it day and night. He has been faithful in crying out, and the absence of a response is frustrating and confusing. This is not the Lord he knows. Verse 4, but you are holy, the one sitting enthroned on Israel's songs of praise. David knows the Lord is the holy God, the one all Israel's praise songs celebrate as a mighty king who delivers them. David wrote many of the praise songs that were collected in the Psalter. But Israel had already been singing songs of praise for centuries. For example, the Song of the Sea and Deborah's song. Verse 5. Our ancestors trusted you. They trusted, and you rescued them. David was not the first to trust in the Lord. The Lord was known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they each trusted in him and were rescued by him multiple times. They were utterly dependent on the Lord to care for them in a foreign land. The plural pronoun, our, in the phrase, our ancestors, is a reminder that this psalm is intended for all the people of Israel, while also reflecting the individual experience of David. Verse 6. They called to you so that they escaped. They trusted in you, and they were not disappointed. When Abraham feared for his life because of Abimelech of Gerar and Pharaoh of Egypt, each time the Lord intervened and protected him. When Isaac feared for his life, the Lord protected him. When Laban pursued Jacob as a thief of both his belongings and his daughters, a vision from the Lord prevented Laban from harming Jacob. When Jacob's sons angered the surrounding Canaanites so much that they wanted to kill the whole family, the terror of the Lord upon the peoples protected Jacob and all his family. The list of deliverances is endless, including both great and small acts. What is different now? The psalmist wants to know. That the Lord is not responding to him the same way. Verse 7. But I am a worm and not a man. I'm scorned by mankind and despised by people. Because the Lord has not answered the psalmist, he feels as insignificant as a worm, less than a human. Those who see him conclude he's not really trusting the Lord. They think that he must in some way deserve his suffering. If he is responsible for his own suffering, then he deserves to be scorned and despised. The first words, but I, indicate the contrast between how the Lord treated his ancestors and how he is now treating David. The difference could not be greater, and David does not understand why. Verse 8. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They open their mouth wide. They shake their head. When people open their mouth wide and shake their head, they're expressing mockery and even contempt. This is a humiliating spectacle for all to see, a display of open shame. In a society that prizes honor, this is the worst experience possible. Verse 9. Commit it to the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him because he is pleased with him. This is the voice of the mockers. It is possible that David would tell others to commit their troubles to the Lord, but now they return the advice sarcastically. Go ahead, David. Commit it to the Lord. They do not believe that the Lord will answer, so they continue with their sarcasm. If the Lord is really pleased with him, as David claims, let him rescue him. The people watching are convinced that the Lord will not rescue him. So only when they mock David do they even speak of deliverance. Verse 10. However, you are the one who took me out of the womb, who made me feel secure upon my mother's breasts. The mockers may have intended their advice to expose how useless David's beliefs are, but he still believes he should commit himself to the Lord. The Lord is the one whom David has trusted since birth. The midwife imagery of the person who caught David as he was born and delivered him to the protective care of his mother reminds God of his responsibility toward David. If God brought him into life, it remains his responsibility to help him through life. Verse 11, I have been cast upon you from the womb. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Here the image shifts, comparing God to a mother who nursed and gave life to an infant. God has cared for him, tending faithfully to his needs since birth. It cannot be that God would stop being faithful. That is not God's character. David cannot reconcile his present experience with his past experience. The first section opened with David asking why God was far from his words of groaning. The second section, crisis, opens with David pleading for God not to be far from him. The very fact that he continues to plead demonstrates that although it does feel like God is far away, the psalmist does not yet believe God really has abandoned him. Verse 12, don't be far from me, because trouble is near, because there is no one helping. Here is the slight shift from confusion about God seeming to be far away to a final cry, desperately asking for help one more time. Trouble is near, perhaps in the form of sickness, and David has been abandoned by everyone else. When a king was suffering, he would often receive visitors wishing him good health. International allies, including aspiring allies, would even send messengers and gifts to express political goodwill, like what happened with the Babylonians and Hezekiah. However, since this was a moment of weakness for the king, political opponents might take the opportunity to strengthen their position at the expense of the king. In this case of Psalm 22, the king did not recover from his suffering, even after much petitioning of the Lord. A person who continued to suffer would be viewed as rejected by God, and therefore the community would avoid them. In David's case, all his former friends and helpers are gone. He has been abandoned by all the people. The only hope that remains is the Lord himself. He is used to expecting the Lord's presence. He fully recognizes that there is no escape from this trouble on his own. Verse 13. Many bulls have surrounded me. Mighty ones of Bashan have surrounded me. As seen above, the people who ought to help stopped helping. But now, people are acting like enemies, taking advantage of the situation. David compares them to dangerous animals. Bulls are images of pride and self-reliance. Bashan was known for large cattle with good grazing land, so the best of the bulls came from Bashan. Bulls are also known for mauling and impaling smaller animals. David's enemies have, in their arrogance, taken a position where they can easily threaten him. They are preparing to attack his reputation. Their strength is far greater than his. They are mighty, and he is vulnerable. Verse 14. They have opened their mouth wide against me, like a mauling and roaring lion. When the enemies opened their mouths wide, above, it was an insult. Here, the wide open mouth becomes the imminent attack of a lion, ready to maul. This lion is roaring to warn anyone who might dare help that they should not interfere. The image of prideful bulls has been replaced by vicious lions in the middle of devouring their prey and determined to finish their meal. This image indicates enemies who have already begun harming David, likely by slander, and are now contemplating even worse offenses. Verse 15. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax. It is melted like wax in the midst of my interior. This verse is the only one with 4 lines, all quite short in the Hebrew. It is probably a poetic device to show how quickly the danger is approaching and how desperate the psalmist is. His emotional distress is extreme. His body has become like water being poured out of a container. He's unable to control his body, but can visibly see it wasting away. His bones, being disjointed, are another image of a body unable to hold itself upright and control its own movements. David has lost basic abilities and functions, perhaps physically, if he is physically sick, or perhaps as king, if he is no longer being obeyed as rightful ruler over the land. Wax can convert from a solid and robust state to melting completely when in the context of heat. David's heart, representing his confidence and ability to think, has dissolved within the context of trauma. He has lost the sense of control and ability to direct his thoughts. Fear is causing him to fall apart. Verse 16. My strength has dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to the roof of my mouth. And you place me in the dust of death. David has lost control, and now he also describes losing his strength. A potsherd, a piece of broken pottery, would be thrown out as dry, brittle, and useless. David's strength is gone, rendering him socially useless. David's hope lies in the deliverance of the Lord, whose nature is to answer when David cries out for help. But how can he cry out, however, if his tongue clings to the roof of his mouth because it is so dry? Because his mouth is too dry to be able to speak, David is helpless even to ask for help. The last line is significant because David shifts to addressing the Lord as you. David knows the Lord is fully in control, which means he must have permitted David to suffer, even to the point where he can no longer cry out. This means the Lord himself is placing David on the path to death, or, in this image, in the dust of death. Without intervention, David will die. The image of the dust of death will return later in the psalm, at the end of the story. At this point, it looks like impending death for the psalmist. David begins to envision what this death would look like. Verse 17, because dogs have surrounded me. A company of evildoers has encompassed me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. David can only conclude that the Lord is bringing him close to death because he has no other reason for his suffering. His enemies are now pictured as dogs who surround him. Dogs in the ancient world were not pets. They were unclean, greedy scavengers who gathered near corpses since they were easy prey. There could only be dogs around if he were about to die, with his own corpse their prey. The images of first bulls, then lions, and now dogs together represent a company of evildoers. The bulls were threatening, the lions mauling, and the dogs are the scavengers who pick up the leftovers. David imagines himself effectively dead, surrounded by those who take pleasure in it. Our exegetical issues video explains why we understand the last line as, they have pierced my hands and my feet. In the context of a person already effectively dead, pierce may refer to preparation for hanging a corpse in triumph on a city wall, like the Philistines did with Saul and his sons on the wall of Bet-shan. This was preparation for public humiliation, such as was known in the time of David. Verse 18. I can count all of my bones. They look. They gaze at me. David continues speaking as if he is nearly dead, or almost as if he is already dead. Only the bones of an exposed skeleton can be counted, which is all that would be left after scavengers were done with the body. The people see all that is happening, but they take no action. They freely gaze or stare, but do not intervene to lessen the disgrace of a body left to the open air. In ancient Israelite culture, this was the most shameful way to be treated after death, because no honor was shown to the body. By contrast, although Saul and his sons were first hung on the wall of Bet-shan by their enemies, the Philistines, it did not end there. The men from Jabesh-Gilead marched overnight to take down the bodies, burned them to remove the shame, and buried the bones with honor, accompanied by fasting. However, those watching what will soon be David's corpse, as he imagines it, have no thought to honor him. Verse 19. They divide my clothes among themselves, and cast a lot for my garment. Those watching David only pay attention to how they can benefit. They divide up what is left to be taken, his very clothes. What cannot be divided up, they cast lots for. When people cast lots, they would use small marked stones to make a random selection. Instead of showing honor by burying the body with whatever remained on it, they plunder it for themselves. No greater shame could befall a person, let alone a king. We're still in the crisis section, but even after David's death and exposed body seem inevitable, there remains one last hope for a final cry for help. David has not yet actually died, even if he can imagine it. Verse 20. But you, Lord, don't be far. My strength, hurry to my aid. Verse 12 also opened with the cry, don't be far from me. Then it was trouble that was near when the bulls, lions, and dogs surrounded him. David's own strength had long ago dried up like a potsherd, and he had even imagined a gruesome end. Before that end becomes a reality, he cries out one more time and asks God to be his strength and help. Verse 21 to 22, the first part. Rescue my life from a sword, my only life from a dog's power. Save me from a lion's mouth and from wild oxen's horns. In this cry, David seeks a complete reversal, an undoing of any piercing by a sword, of the scavenging of the dogs, the mauling of the lions, and the threat to the wild oxen or bulls. David experienced many betrayals. This psalm may refer to one of those. For example, Absalom, David's own son, rebelled and betrayed David. Absalom proclaimed himself king instead of David, and he sent an army to chase his father down and kill him. The images of shame and desecration in the psalm fit well the shame and desecration David must have experienced at that time. His kingship was effectively over, and instead of honor, he received curses and stones and dirts thrown at him. The psalm itself gives no indication which events prompted its writing, but it must have been one of the worst moments of David's life. When things are at their absolute worst, he still pleads with the Lord to undo all the shame. But before David can even finish the last line of his plea, he's cut off. According to the normal expectations of Hebrew poetry, after, from wild oxen's horns, we would expect another plea, such as, "Deliver me," or "Rescue me." That does not happen, however. Verse 22, the last phrase, "You answered me!" Before his cry for help has even been fully spoken, it is transformed, with no warning, into a cry of delight that the Lord has answered. The poetry does not flow smoothly here. The shift from cry for help to announcement that the Lord has answered is unexpected and abrupt. Many have sought to change the text, finding it too abrupt. This is the heart of the psalm, however. What was overwhelming and crushing suffering is unexpectedly and abruptly transformed into praise. Everything changes in an instant with little warning. With this one Hebrew word, "You answered me," the celebration section begins. It may have seemed as if the Lord were abandoning the afflicted, but that was not the full story. The full story was that he did hear the one who called out to him, and he did honor him. Verse 23, "I will announce your name to my brothers. I will praise you in the midst of the community." The Israelite response to deliverance was to publicly give thanks in the context of worship. To announce your name was to openly declare the Lord's character by testifying about his deeds, which are seen in this psalm through David's experience of suffering and deliverance. The psalmist was at first lonely and abandoned. Now he will be in the midst of the community, surrounded by his own brothers or fellow Israelites. The community will worship alongside him. The word "I will announce" is the same as the Hebrew word "I can count" in verse 18. Then the psalmist envisioned his own nearly dead body, picked over by dogs. That image has been replaced by public praise. The experience of suffering is being replaced by an experience of praise. Verse 24, "You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, honor him, and be in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel." As if he is physically standing in the assembly of worshipers, David now directly addresses them, first as those who fear the Lord, then as offspring of Jacob, and finally as offspring of Israel. All three refer to the Israelites as a group. He calls them to praise in three slightly different ways: to praise, honor, and be in awe of the Lord. David is not asking for a formality or only an external expression. He wants a wholehearted response that is all at once external praise, genuine honor, and internal awe of the God who is so worth praising. Verse 25, "Because he has not regarded as worthless nor detestable the sufferer's affliction, and he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cries to him for help." The suffering and affliction have not been forgotten, but they are now seen very differently. The Lord did not hide his face from the sufferer. He did hear his cries, even if he did not reply for a time. In spite of all the sufferer experienced at the time, the Lord did not treat or regard the affliction as worthless or detestable. People considered him worthless, like a worm, and detestable, only to be scorned. But the Lord did not share in any of those views. This is very indirect speech. We know from the end of verse 22 that the Lord answered the psalmist, and the celebration indicates he was certainly delivered, but we have no more details. This indicates the specific details were irrelevant, and possibly the psalm was composed in response to many such experiences. What does matter is that the Lord's attitude was the opposite of what the psalmist feared. The suffering had a purpose and was somehow worthwhile. The sufferer was still fully acceptable to the Lord and in relationship with him, in spite of how much time passed before the Lord answered. Verse 26. My praise among a great community is from you. I will fulfill my vows in the presence of those who fear him. The Hebrew highlights from you. The motivation for praise is who the Lord is and what he has done. The suffering, even though it was difficult and long, is eclipsed altogether by the praise given to the Lord. It is only remembered as the occasion for making vows. These vows are the customary response to deliverance, in which the rescued person vows to give thanks in the public assembly, sometimes including a fellowship meal of thanksgiving. Verse 27. The afflicted will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. May your heart live forever. In this case, the vows did include a fellowship meal, which would include an invitation to the poor and suffering of the community to come, share a meal, and hear about the Lord's recent rescue of the psalmist. The afflicted here is the opposite of the proud. They are the humble, those who know they are dependent on the Lord for their provision. They are those who are vulnerable and often suffer. When the psalmist celebrates being rescued by the Lord, the afflicted literally join in by sharing in a meal. They eat until they are satisfied, which for the poor may have been a rare occasion. This is a time to experience in reality how fully the Lord provides for his people. The abundant praise, which is the offering to the Lord, is matched by the abundance of food, which is an offering to the Lord's people. Through this, the psalmist fulfills his vows both to his God and his people. The last line of verse 27 is a direct address to his guests, along the lines of a toast. May your heart live forever. In other words, may the joy belonging to you guests who have come to celebrate the Lord's deliverance be long-lasting. May this moment of celebration and feasting be a glimpse of what will last forever. Verse 28. Let all of the ends of the earth consider, so that they will turn to the Lord, so that all of the families of the nations will worship before you. The psalmist's deliverance is not to be celebrated only by Israel. It represents the character and deeds of the Lord, whom all families and nations of the earth are called to worship. The focus shifts from the psalmist's own suffering and relief to the Lord as the God whom the whole earth should follow and worship. Verse 29. Because the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. A characteristic of many Hebrew poems is an initial focus on one instance of trouble and deliverance, followed by putting that instance in a universal setting. David's own deliverance has prompted him to worship the Lord, not only as the God of the moment, but as the God of the whole earth. The kingdom is his, meaning he is the rightful king over the earth, as ruler over all the nations. Because God is the rightful king, all the ends of the earth should turn to him and worship him. The connection between David's own suffering and God's kingship over the nations is not made explicit by the poem, but it is implicit. Verse 30. All of the strong ones of the earth have eaten and worshipped. All of those going down to dust will kneel before him, that is, whose life he will not have preserved. The fellowship meal just served, when the poor and afflicted of David's day ate and were satisfied, is connected to an imagined fellowship meal of the future, when all the strong ones of the earth will both eat and worship the Lord. In this way, all the nations of the earth, including both the weak and the strong, will join together in a meal to celebrate what the Lord has done. Before, in verse 16, it was the Lord who was placing the psalmist in the dust. Contrary to what was expected, his life was preserved. Preserving his life was an opportunity for praise. But it is not required to praise and worship the Lord. Here, some of the strong are recognized as on their way to death because the Lord will not have preserved their life. Nonetheless, they will still kneel before the Lord in worship. Death is no longer an obstacle to praise. Very subtly, the poem here shows that even death itself yields to the Lord's purposes and his worship. Verse 31, future generations will serve him. It will be proclaimed concerning the Lord to the generation. One generation may die, but it will be replaced by future generations that will serve the Lord. Who the Lord is and what he does still deserves to be proclaimed from generation to generation. It will be proclaimed is another repetition of the word that in verse 18 was, I can count, and in verse 23 was, I will announce. Suffering was replaced with public praise, which is now replaced with future repeated praise. Suffering is not worth repeating, but what the Lord has done is exactly what is worth repeating. Verse 32, let them come so that they tell his righteous deed to a people being born, what he has done. His righteous deed is the action the Lord has done, which is always deliverance of some kind. Even though some people will die, there is still deliverance worth proclaiming. In this final verse of the poem, the different themes come together. First, there was the psalmist envisioning his own death. Then the strong people of the earth knelt before God, even though they would lose their own lives. In this last verse, there is a people being born. This people is being told the righteous deed of the Lord, which in context must refer to the deliverance of the psalmist. The death which David so vividly envisioned may have applied to his kingship, if not to his body, but the result was praising the Lord for his deliverance. The strong people of the earth, even those whose lives would not be saved, continued to praise and worship the Lord. A people yet to come, not even born yet, must be told of the Lord's righteous deeds in order that they might praise him. Suffering, death, and life all yield to praise from the middle of verse 22 on. Neither David's suffering nor the death of the strong was worthless. The psalm insists that what matters most is that the Lord deserves praise because of how he saves his people, and he deserves that praise from his people, past, present, and future. Psalm 22 began with the agonizing cry because David felt abandoned by God. Confusion was the dominant emotion as the psalmist wrestled with the Lord's history of saving his ancestors faithfully and answering their cries. It did not make sense that this time he did not seem to be answering the psalmist's cries. The middle of the psalm intensified the crisis, as the mocking onlookers became like predatory animals, seeking to hunt down, devour, and even scavenge the vulnerable body of the psalmist. Death was imminent when the psalmist gave one last cry, a cry which was interrupted with surprising abruptness with deliverance. The suffering is subtly undone, first with the bull, lion, dog sequence reversed, then "you do not answer" replaced by "you answered." Counting bones of a dead man is replaced by announcing public praise of the deliverance, and so on. The tone and content of the poem shift decisively to celebrating the Lord. Suffering and death are not worthless, but their purpose is not the focus. No matter how deep the suffering, it is nearly forgotten in comparison to the magnitude of the praise that is due in response to the Lord's saving acts. No matter how great the affliction, the result of the Lord's deliverance inspires his people to respond with even greater worship. We will now read the entire psalm. For the director, according to the doe of the dawn, a psalm by David. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you far from my protection, from my words of groaning? My God, I cry out by day, but you don't answer, and by night, and I am not silent. But you are holy, the one sitting enthroned on Israel's songs of praise. Our ancestors trusted you. They trusted, and you rescued them. They called to you so that they escaped. They trusted you, and they were not disappointed. But I am a worm, and not a man. I am scorned by mankind, and despised by people. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They open their mouth wide. They shake their head. Commit it to the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, because he is pleased with him. However, you are the one who took me out of the womb, who made me feel secure upon my mother's breasts. I have been cast upon you from the womb. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Don't be far from me, because trouble is near, because there is no one helping. Many bulls have surrounded me. Mighty ones of Bashan have surrounded me. They've opened their mouth wide against me, like a mauling and roaring lion. I'm poured out like water, and all of my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax. It is melted like wax in the midst of my interior. My strength has dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to the roof of my mouth. And you place me in the dust of death. Because dogs have surrounded me, a company of evildoers has encompassed me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all of my bones. They look, they gaze at me. They divide my clothes among themselves and cast a lot for my garment. But you, Lord, don't be far. My strength, hurry to my aid. Rescue my life from a sword, my only life from a dog's power. Save me from a lion's mouth and from wild oxen's horns. You answered me. I will announce your name to my brothers. I will praise you in the midst of the community. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, honor him, and be in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. Because he has not regarded as worthless nor detestable the sufferer's affliction, and he has not hidden his face from him. But he has heard when he cries to him for help. My praise among a great community is from you. I will fulfill my vows in the presence of those who fear him. The afflicted will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. May your heart live forever. Let all of the ends of the earth consider, so that they will turn to the Lord, so that all of the families of the nations will worship before you, because the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. All the strong ones of the earth have eaten and worshipped. All of those going down to dust will kneel before him, that is, whose life he will not have preserved. Future generations will serve him. It will be proclaimed concerning the Lord to the generation. Let them come so that they tell his righteous deed to a people being born. What he has done. This has been the overview video for Psalm 22. Our goal in this video is to present a single coherent interpretation of the psalm. Our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views, and our poetic features video explores the distinctively poetic nature of the psalm as Hebrew poetry. Please visit us at scriptura.world to learn more. Thank you.